Our next speaker is Bernice Bovenkerk. She's from the Netherlands. She holds the degree in environmental philosophy from the University of Amsterdam. She performed a PhD jointly between the Universities of Melbourne in Australia and the University of Utrecht, where she then continued to work as a postdoc at the Ethics Institute. She received 2 awards from the National Science Academy. It's more than unusual, this is what I heard. And she was appointed 2013 to the Wageningen University, where she's working now as an associate professor in the group of philosophy. We're very much looking forward to hear your topic and hear your talk about ethical perspectives on modifying animals behind welfare arguments. The floor is yours, Bernice.
Okay, thank you, Matthias, and thank you very much to the organizers as well for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to be here and to be able to speak to you today about ethical perspectives on modifying animals. So one of the first applications of genetic modification to animals were the so-called Beltsville pigs that you can see here on my left. This picture, not that one, of course. Sorry, that was a bit of a shock to see myself there. So, researchers at the US Agricultural Research Service at Beltsville in Maryland inserted a gene for human growth hormone into pigs in order to achieve a better food conversion ratio. And as you can see on the picture, it worked in one sense. But it also led to many problems. It led to many health and welfare problems in the pigs, such as arthritis and lung problems, and it ultimately led the researchers to terminate the experiment. Now, this case was seized upon by critics of biotechnology to argue that genetic modification of animals is unacceptable. But I don't think they had a very strong case. It was recognized by the researchers that harm was done to the animals and therefore they terminated the experiment. But in reality, most modified animals do not actually experience welfare problems. In fact, genetic modification is often being employed to solve welfare problems. So to give you an example, if it pops up, yes, the so-called polled cattle that is bred to not grow horns, that is actually done to prevent welfare problems from occurring, harm to other cattle or harm to farmers. So is this then the end of story, no harm done? I don't think so. I think a lot of people still have problems with genetic modification of animals, whether or not there are any welfare problems. So perhaps it would be better of the critics to focus on those problems rather than on welfare. Now, of course, you could say that currently very narrow conceptions of welfare are being used. So commonly used criteria, such as the Bramble's 5 freedoms that I'm assuming that most of you will be familiar with, and otherwise you can see them in the box there. The problem there is that they do not actually constitute welfare, but only the necessary conditions for welfare. So the idea is that welfare is more than what you can actually objectively determine or measure. You could also think of a broader sense of the term welfare, maybe you could call it well-being, at which you don't look at specific points in time of an animal's life, but you look at the well-being of the animal over the whole course of the animal's life. Now, of course, also in this broader sense of welfare or well-being, things such as freedom from injury, freedom from pain are very important, but there are also a lot of other issues that are important for well-being, such as is the animal able to enjoy itself? Does it reach what it wants to achieve? Does it have good relationships with its conspecifics? So the central question then becomes, what is the good life for animals? So if you want to think of animal welfare in a broader sense of the term, you have to think about that. But still, the problem is that genetic modification does not necessarily interfere with welfare in that broader sense of the term either. And still moral objections remain in society. So welfare or well-being in the end are about the subjective experiences of animals, but many of the moral discussions are actually not about the experiences of the animals at all, but about the experiences of human beings. So it is about the question, what does it do to our own view of the world, our own view of animals and the way they should be? So in other words, there are objections to genetic modification that move beyond welfare issues, and these will be the focus of my talk today. So I will briefly discuss 4 clusters of such arguments or objections. Firstly, I will talk about the idea that it violates the integrity of the animals. Secondly, I'll talk about the idea that it instrumentalizes animals or it objectifies them. Then I'll talk about the objection that it amounts to playing God. Or finally, I will talk about the idea that genetic modification is unnatural. And now actually, if you look at these objections, it is important to note that they don't only hold for genetic modifications of animals, but they actually apply to other modifications as well. So for example, through artificial breeding. And so I carried out research myself recently, together with my lovely assistant Hanneke Nijland, who's sitting there, about pedigree dog breeding. And what people felt about pedigree dog breeding, and I encountered all of these arguments as well. Now, in this short talk, I won't be able to give a comprehensive overview of objections to modifications of animals, and I'll only really focus on the main ones within animal ethics. There are also objections or arguments that move beyond animal ethics, that are, for example, about justice between people, but I won't go into these now. And I won't be able to go into them very deeply, but for that reason, I have included references to literature in my slides. So if you want to learn more about them, then you can read those. Now, after my overview, I will raise the question, well, what is actually the upshot of these arguments? What should we make of these arguments? There is a quite broad agreement now that it is important not to harm the welfare of animals, but there is a lot less consensus about these sort of objections that I'm going to be talking about. And I will argue that this is because they can be traced to people's worldviews or to people's notions of the good life, and that is actually something that people fundamentally disagree about. Still, I will argue that we shouldn't relegate them to the private sphere, but that we should actually discuss them publicly, that it's important to discuss them publicly and amongst each other. All right. So let's have a look at those 4 clusters of objections. The first one is the idea of integrity violation. Even though this concept of integrity has been applied to the debate about genetic modification of animals, it was actually originally used to articulate more general objections to interventions that cannot be expressed in terms of harm or welfare to animals. Now, it has been described by a colleague of mine from the Netherlands, Bart Rutgers, as the wholeness and intactness of the animal, its species-specific balance, and the capacity to sustain itself in an environment suitable to the species. So, to give a couple of examples, a dog whose tail has been docked, such as you can see on this picture here, is no longer intact. So therefore you could say it has been violated in its integrity. Or a Belgian blue cow who can no longer give birth naturally can no longer sustain itself in an environment suitable to its species. So therefore you could also say its integrity has been violated. Now, at first sight, it seems that this idea of violation of integrity refers to a biological norm. But in fact, not all interventions in animals where their intactness is violated would actually count as violations of integrity. So, for example, the case of the dog again, if you dock a dog's tail for medical purposes, people do not tend to consider it a violation of the dog's integrity. You're actually restoring the dog's integrity. But if you do it for aesthetic purposes, then it is considered an integrity violation. So therefore, this is not so much a biological norm, but rather a moral norm. It primarily refers to the intention behind the interference. Another thing to know about integrity is that it refers to a species-typical norm. As you recall, it said that integrity meant that the animal could sustain itself in an environment suitable to the species. So the question then becomes, of course, what is the species. What is a cow in a farm? Should you relate that to the natural situation of the farm or of the cow, or to the situation of the cow as it is adapted to the farm environment? Well, in this objection, it seems that it's usually about how the animal would behave in nature. So the ideal image is that of the natural animal, so to speak. And so what we're doing when we're violating an animal's integrity is that we're somehow, violating the cowness of the cow or the chickenness of the chicken. We're somehow making it less of a cow because we're interfering with it, is the idea here. Of course, this gives rise to the question of why, this ideal image of the animal in nature. And this actually relies on, a picture of what sort of moral status we give to animals. I will come back to that later. Now, what it is about this whole idea of integrity violation is that it is a concept that has proven to be quite hard to give a conclusive justification for within ethical theory, but at the same time, it really seems to appeal to an intuition that a lot of people have, that we should not tamper with the genetic makeup of animals. Now, of course, just saying that something, that a lot of people have an intuition doesn't make it right. That's why we have ethical theory. We have to discuss what could be behind this intuition. And as I will also say and explain a bit more in terms of the other objections, I think a lot of these intuitions are really about worldviews. They come back to worldviews. And therefore, it is hard to give a conclusive justification for them in the more sort of analytical types of philosophy. But something that's interesting about integrity as well, especially in the Netherlands, is that it has proven to be useful in practice. So the Dutch Committee for Animal Biotechnology, for example, uses integrity violation as one of its criteria when it has to establish whether or not to grant a license for biotechnological procedures with animals. So it has proven useful, at least as, what we call a boundary object, something that you can talk about even though you might not agree exactly about the content of that concept. All right, so the next objection was that to instrumentalization. And this actually refers to a cluster of objections that have been termed, for example, objectification of animals, commodification, alienation of animals to their own bodies, and de-animalization. So I think a lot of this is quite similar to what Professor Francioni has told us about the idea that animals are not things, they're not property. And if we treat them as if they are a thing, we manufacture them as if they could come rolling off a conveyor belt, then we are doing something wrong according to this objection. So there's actually two senses in which you can use this objection. You can distinguish two meanings. One is an animal is treated as if it were an object, and the other one is that you're actually going a step further. You're actually turning it into an object. You're making an artifact out of it. Now, why would this be problematic? Well, treating an animal as if it were an object leads to a denial of its own interests and of its own nature. And it is very easy to then mistreat the animal and to only zoom in on one specific aspect of the animal. If you look at an animal being turned into an object, this can happen intentionally or not, then that basically means that an animal is treated solely as an instrument for our use. And it's sort of disregarded that it also has its own purposes in life, and that it is in fact turned, at least partly, into an artifact. So the animals then become sort of living parts of machinery. They're adapted to fit into our own production systems. So to give an example, you could use CRISPR-Cas to breed pigs that are immune to viral infections. And of course, on the one hand, this is very good for the pigs because it saves a lot of pigs' lives. But on the other hand, there are those who argue that we wouldn't really see so many viral infections in pigs in the first place if they were not held in such intensive farming conditions. And if you think back about my previous example of the polled cattle again, you can also raise the question, is it really necessary to dehorn cattle if they were held in a more natural situation? Now, of course, these are empirical discussions. I don't have the answer to them here, but what is important for my purposes is that what is behind these discussions is the question whether we should adapt an animal to the farm or whether we should adapt the farm to the animal. And this idea is something that, that really appeals to a lot of people's intuitions. Like when I talk to students about this, for example, they say, yeah, exactly, that's a problem I have with a lot of things that are being done at farms with animals, is that the animals are being used as if they're just production units, and they are being made to adapt into a system that we have designed. Now, I've talked to some animal welfare scientists about this as well, and they say, yeah, of course, it's never one or the other. We both adapt the animal to the farm and the farm to the animal, but that sort of doesn't solve this objection, because people who hold this view, they do not think that we should adapt the animal to the farm at all, not a little bit either. And why is this then seen as problematic? Because the animal's own subjectivity or their own autonomy is denied. They're not seen as individuals in their own right, but they're seen as replaceable. One dies, you can just replace it with another. And that's how we treat things. That's not how we treat living, sensitive beings, is the idea. And I've included a picture here of the Dutch Kipster farm. I think some people in the audience might have already recognized it. So this is a farm in the Netherlands where they've actually tried to adapt the farming conditions as much as possible to the chickens' needs. And they also have much more possibilities to choose for themselves where they want to go, where they want to roost, and things like that. And this actually connects to my current research, which is about animal agency and how we should think of animal agency. Well, this is one example where you could give animals a lot more agency over their own environment. Now, a related notion is that of de-animalization, and this was coined by Jess Harveld and others that you can see here on the screen. And this basically means that production animals, in their view, are taken out of their own evolutionary and environmental context, and they're reduced to a production unit or to an artifact for our use. And by this reduction to their bodily functions, there is room left for few other capabilities and behaviors than just giving offspring, producing milk, and dying. And their argument is, well, yet there is so much more to an animal life than just these capabilities and these behaviors. Now, what they present is actually a virtue ethical argument. And very briefly, virtue ethics claims that what we need to do is cultivate the right moral character, and we do this by behaving virtuously and by building up the moral knowledge or the moral wisdom to know how to lead a good life. So basically what Harveld claims is that the experience of animals and their complex behaviors within their natural setting is what is necessary to build up this moral wisdom about animals and to build up moral character, and this will help us make sound judgments regarding the treatment of animals. They actually argue that the current conditions in livestock production are detrimental to our grasping what they call the animalness of animals, and this makes us fail to give animals proper moral consideration. So let's move on to the next objection, the idea that intervening in animals' genetic makeup, whether through genetic modification or artificial breeding, amounts to playing God. And this argument actually rejects the intervention in the order of creation. It expresses an intuition that there are certain boundaries that should not be crossed by humans. So the idea is that the power to create lies in the hands of God, and we should be respectful of that as human beings. Now, this is one possible interpretation of this argument, but this objection, in fact, is not usually meant as a religious objection. And as a matter of fact, there are also theologians who argue that God created humans as co-creators, and therefore they don't see necessarily a problem with genetically modifying animals per se. So usually it's meant as a secular argument about the proper role that human beings should play within nature, or the proper role that they should play vis-a-vis our technologies. This objection rejects the pretension that a lot of humans have of control and of almightiness, and this is something that was already central in the ancient Greek mythology and the idea of human hubris or arrogance. And of course, it's also a theme in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, the objection warns against the human tendency to think that we can control life, that we can manufacture life, and that everything can be completely planned. So, and it warns against the unpredictability of life. Now, this is not a knockdown argument about modifications of animals as such, but you could see it as a warning that we shouldn't expect too much control over nature. So it also could be seen as a view about, well, our proper role versus nature or within nature. So that also connects to our last objection, the idea that genetic modification or artificial breeding of animals is unnatural. When this argument is invoked, that often basically refers to the idea that certain natural boundaries have been crossed. So, for example, the boundaries between species. Now, and then a common response you hear to this is, well, but if you look at it on a genome level, there are not really any species boundaries. Well, in a sense, that's true, of course, but I think that response misses the point of the objection. So the point is not that something is being done that would never be done in nature. The point is that the interference itself is deemed unnatural, according to this objection, because it is carried out by humans. So the reference point for naturalness then seems to be the untouched animal, as it would appear in nature as the end result of a process of evolution. And the natural is then seen as opposed to artificial or opposed to cultural. So by invoking this naturalness objection in this context, critics mean that by adapting animals, we're doing something artificial, or we're basically turning an animal into an artifact. So this argument then goes back again to our second argument that it instrumentalizes animals. Now, philosophers tend to struggle a lot with this argument, and that's because it can easily be rejected as a so-called naturalistic fallacy. Now, according to this naturalistic fallacy, we cannot directly argue from an observation in nature to a moral conclusion or a moral guide to conduct. If we argue from an observation in nature directly, we're basically making an is-ought fallacy, and in this case, it's called a naturalistic fallacy. So we should not take nature as a guide to our moral actions. I mean, in nature, lots of cruel things happen. Some animals eat the babies of their competitors. That doesn't mean that we get to eat the babies of our competitors, hopefully, right? So we shouldn't take that as a moral guide for our actions, is the idea. And another problem with this argument is that it can be misused for political reasons. So think of sayings such as, well, women are by nature very caring, so therefore they should stay home and look after the children. Right? So this appeal to naturalness can be easily misused. And therefore, a lot of philosophers have argued, well, it's not that we find something bad because it is unnatural, but actually we find it unnatural because we find it bad or we find it undesirable. But that doesn't solve the picture. You have to have an extra argument to actually explain why it would be bad. And anyway, many unnatural things are generally considered good. So, for example, wearing glasses, in a sense, could be thought of, something unnatural, but nobody would argue that it is immoral to wear glasses. So we need an extra argument, and it is a difficult argument in philosophy, but still, it is an interesting one, I think, because in discussions about modifying animals, it keeps on popping up. I also kept on running into it in my research about pedigree dog breeding. So, for example, when we would ask people, well, what do you think about putting coats on dogs? Then a lot of people would say, well, that's just unnatural. And then when we ask them about genetic modification, or, for example, breeding a zebra dog, that's one of the questions we ask them, they would say, well, no, I'm against that because it's unnatural. So apparently, that unnaturalness argument appeals to a deeply felt intuition that a lot of people have. So what could be behind that intuition then? I mean, it's very easy to just dismiss it as a naturalistic fallacy, but because it keeps on popping up, it sort of raised my interest. Maybe there is more to that argument than meets the eye. Now, in my own research, I found that actually the step from calling something unnatural to calling it morally wrong wasn't actually made directly. There was an extra argument, or at least a worldview or a specific moral outlook behind it. It relied on a view about nature, and it relied on a view about our relationships to animals. It relied on the rejection of an instrumental vision on nature and animals, as if they are just well, resources for our own use. So several of my respondents actually reasoned from an attitude of respect for nature and animals, and they also had respect for evolutionary processes. And now that by no means meant that they thought that all results of evolutionary processes were necessarily good or benign, but at least they said, since natural adaptations have been tried and tested for much longer than our artificial adaptations, humans should at least take a more modest attitude, and they can learn from nature rather than trying to change it. So the unnaturalist argument should be understood as a way to express the meaning and the value that people attach to nature and the view that they have on our role within nature that should be more modest. Also, they pointed out that there are certain gradations, like you could say that something is more or less natural. It's not as if they were always saying, oh, this is completely unnatural, so it's therefore wrong. They would say, well, the more natural it is, the more at ease I am with it. So with this argument, you could say it's not a hard and fast criterion to distinguish acceptable from unacceptable actions, but it points to a larger discussion about, well, what sort of role we should play within nature and what view of nature we have. So what is the upshot of all these arguments then? If we look at all those arguments that move beyond welfare, we see many overlaps. For example, they all refer to the idea that animals are not things and they shouldn't be treated as such, and also that we should have a more modest attitude towards nature. So what becomes clear is that they're all based on how we view animals, how we view the human-animal relationship and nature relationship, and more broadly on how we see the good life. And we philosophers call that comprehensive notions of the good life, right? Now, if you look at integrity and instrumentalization, you can see that they're based on a view that animals have intrinsic value. They don't only have instrumental value for our own use, but they have a value in and of themselves, and that should be respected. Also, they're based on views about what the ideal animal is, the cowness of the cow or the chickenness of the chicken. If we look at the playing God argument and the naturalness argument, they both express a view on a more modest role that humans should play vis-à-vis nature. So the arguments beyond welfare then appear to be part of those broader conceptions of the good life. And this means that they connect less to so-called rule ethical theories than to what I call life ethical theories. And so this is a very small excursion into ethical theory. There are different distinctions you can make, but this is one distinction that I find particularly useful. You've got rule ethical theories that are much more action guiding than life ethical theories. And they aim to formulate impartial rules to enable peaceful and just cohabitation between individuals. And they tend to be based on quite commonly held moral views. So, for example, they're based on things like, freedom of expression, like we heard before, or things of justice between people. Now, of course, people will disagree about how exactly to implement those principles, but there is sort of a common basis of agreement that those are at least important. Not so with life ethical theories. There, the discussion about the good life is central. So they actually ask questions such as, how do we envisage a good life for humans and animals, and how do we show a proper attitude of respect to other animals? Now, those are not questions that yield one right answer. More answers are possible. They're also not questions that people tend to agree about. Most people now agree that welfare is important, but there's a lot less consensus about things such as integrity or naturalness. So to sum up, there's less agreement on these arguments, and they rely on people's comprehensive notions of the good life, about which people fundamentally differ, and they do not provide clear rules of action. For this reason, understandably, they tend to be relegated to the private sphere. So the idea is that in private, people can think whatever they want, but we're not going to base our public decisions on them. Well, I think that is problematic to do that. By only taking rule ethical principles and theories seriously, many important values and meanings that people attach to life, that people attach to the world around them, are disregarded. If we can only base our decisions on whether or not to modify an animal on questions around welfare, then a lot of important values are excluded and people will not feel heard. In fact, there will be a bias towards actually carrying out lots of interventions on animals because, as I said in the beginning, they often don't tend to yield welfare problems. Of course, there are welfare problems when they're used at the farm later on or in experiments, but the actual modification doesn't tend to harm animals' health or welfare. So there will be a bias in favor of those people who think, well, it's fine to just change the world and manufacture animals, but there are a lot of people who do not feel that way and who have different worldviews. And I think it is important that they are heard as well. So in my view, those objections should be part of public debate. We should not only talk about what modifications of animals should be forbidden or not be forbidden, but we should also talk about the broader implications of what we are proposing with our research, or in fact, what you are proposing with your research. So in public debate, people can actually explain their worldview to others. I mean, I did say there are fundamental disagreements about that, but it doesn't mean you can't argue about them. You can still discuss them, and you can still weigh them on their merits. And, it might very well be that you don't come to agree, but at least you will agree to disagree. At least you will understand each other's viewpoints better. And this means minimally that those who modify animals can proceed with more caution because they realize that there are other people who have different worldviews and who are genuinely concerned about it. It also means that we shouldn't blindly employ our technology on animals, but that we should reflect on what modifications mean for our relationship to other animals, and also in the end that leads us to reflect on what kind of world we want to live in. And I think, I'm talking about public debate here, but of course this debate should be held by people like you, for starters, because you know what sort of future applications are being proposed for modifying animals. So you have inside knowledge, and it's very important for you, I think, to also discuss the broader implications. So I guess you should all join Bart's ethics committee and discuss all this. And, well, that was the end of my talk. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very, very nice talk, very interesting talk. We take the time for 1 or 2 questions while I'm asking the speakers already slowly to move over to the chairs, and then we start the overall discussion. Do you have any questions for Bernice? Here's one, please.
He doesn't have a microphone.
Bernice, thank you for this political right talk. There's one thing that I was wondering about. You didn't call the name Herman in your speech, and that was the start of it all. That was the pool Herman who was created in the Netherlands. And can you comment a little bit about the values, how they have changed around the last 20, 25 years, and perhaps you can comment about what you think is going to happen the next 20 years about the values you mentioned about, because you see that they are not fast, and they are also evaluating. Perhaps you can comment a little bit about that.
Okay. Yeah, so of course Herman is where it started all. That's where I started my research as well, but I decided not to talk about Herman this time because the application of his genetic modification was more in the medical sphere, and I thought the Beltsville pigs are a clear example of livestock farming. So you're asking me to project into the future, which is always really dangerous for ethicists to do. I mean, we have to make projections because otherwise we cannot make sound moral judgments, but at the same time, there's always a lot of wishful thinking involved. And, you can ask me on a pessimistic day or an optimistic day. And so if you ask me on an optimistic day, I think, there will be more, more openness in the debate for these sort of objections. Perhaps, more and more people, like we already heard in the last talk, more and more people do see that perhaps we should go vegan, or they think that we should go vegan. And maybe this will also extend to other modifications on animals. And people will discuss this more seriously and have a real discussion about, well, what sort of life we want to live in and what is the future of our farming. Does it have to be highly intensive with lots of technological inputs, or are there other options as well? On a more pessimistic day, I think, well, we've been discussing this, like you said, for over 20 years, and it's the same arguments that keep on popping up. And, well, it doesn't really reverberate anywhere else in society, or at least a lot of research is going full steam ahead, and a lot of applications are going full steam ahead. So it will really depend, I think, also on the legal climate, and there I really don't want to make any projections. I have no idea.
Thank you very much, Bernice. Let's move.